The first-class cabin buzzed with quiet luxury plush leather seats, champagne glasses clinking, and soft murmurs of conversation. Richard Campbell, a smug businessman eager to flaunt his newfound wealth, settled into his seat with an air of superiority. His gaze landed on a casually dressed man wearing sunglasses, sipping champagne in silence. With a sneer, Richard scoffed, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "First class isn't what it used to be. They let just anyone in these days," he muttered. Passengers exchanged glances, some smirking. The man in sunglasses remained calm, unfazed. Then, a flight attendant leaned over and whispered, "Sir, that's Brad Pitt." Richard's heart stopped. His arrogant smirk faded. He had just made the biggest mistake of his life. The first-class cabin of the luxury aircraft was bathed in a warm golden glow. Plush leather seats, spacious aisles, and the faint sound of soft jazz playing in the background created an atmosphere of pure comfort. The passengers were a mix of business executives, celebrities, and elite travelers, all enjoying their pre-flight drinks. As the cabin crew made final preparations, a man in his late 40s strutted down the aisle, an air of arrogance surrounding him. His name was Richard Campbell, a mid-level hedge fund manager who had recently come into money. Though dressed in an expensive suit, his demeanor gave away his insecurity. He needed to prove himself, and he did so by belittling others. He plopped down in his seat, sighing dramatically, already eyeing the people around him. He had paid for first class after all, and he wanted to make sure everyone knew he belonged there. His gaze landed on a casually dressed man seated near the window, wearing sunglasses and a well-worn leather jacket. He looked relaxed, his presence unassuming. Richard scoffed. Typical. Some nobody probably using airline miles to sneak into first class, he muttered under his breath, loud enough for the man to hear. The man didn't react. He simply leaned back, sipping a glass of champagne. Richard took this as an invitation to keep going. "You know, it's a shame they let just anyone up here these days," he continued, turning slightly to the woman next to him, who was clearly uncomfortable. "I mean, I worked my way up, paid my dues. But now, you have people who don't even dress properly for first class." The woman next to him gave a polite but strained smile and turned away. The casually dressed man, still silent, adjusted his sunglasses, but remained unbothered. Richard wasn't done. You'd think first class would have some standards. But nope, they'll let in anyone who thinks they're important. Probably some washed-up actor or a musician trying to stay relevant. He laughed, expecting others to join in. Instead, the cabin grew quiet. Several passengers exchanged glances, some smirking, others shaking their heads in disbelief. A flight attendant standing nearby looked visibly uncomfortable, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. Richard, oblivious, turned to the casually dressed man. "What about you, buddy? What do you do? Or are you just some guy who got lucky with a free upgrade?" The man finally turned his head, tilting his sunglasses down just enough for Richard to see his eyes blue, piercing and oddly familiar. He smirked, sipping his champagne before setting the glass down. "I act," he said simply. Richard scoffed. "Oh yeah, anything I'd know." A voice from a few seats away chuckled. A young woman, who had been quietly observing the interaction, finally spoke up. "Are you serious? You really don't know who he is?" Richard frowned, his confidence wavering slightly. His eyes darted back to the man in the sunglasses. Before he could say anything, the flight attendant, who had been suppressing a smile, finally interjected. "Sir, I believe you're speaking to Brad Pitt." Silence. Richard's face paled. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. A few passengers chuckled softly, some shaking their heads in amusement. Brad Pitt leaned forward slightly, removing his sunglasses completely. "And you are?" he asked, his tone polite, but with a hint of amusement. Richard stammered. "Oh, I'm Richard. Richard Campbell." Brad nodded slowly, as if considering the name. "Can't say I've heard of you," he said with a small smile. The chuckles in the cabin turned into quiet laughter. Richard's arrogance evaporated instantly. He swallowed hard, his mind racing. I didn't mean any offense," Richard mumbled, forcing a weak smile. Brad waved a hand. "No worries," he said smoothly, leaning back in his seat. "Happens all the time." The flight continued, but Richard couldn't shake the weight of his humiliation. Every so often, he caught other passengers glancing at him with amusement, whispering among themselves. Even the flight attendants seemed to be holding back their laughter when they served him. When the plane finally landed, Richard rushed to grab his belongings, his hands slightly trembling as he shoved his laptop into his expensive leather briefcase. His face was still warm with humiliation, his mind replaying the moment over and over: the laughter, the whispers, the way everyone had stared at him. He avoided eye contact as he shuffled toward the exit, his heart pounding with the desperate need to disappear before anyone could say anything else. The once confident businessman who strutted onto the plane was now a shadow of himself, shoulders hunched, his usual arrogance drained. As he reached the aisle, he suddenly felt a presence beside him. Smooth and effortless, Brad Pitt casually strolled past him, his signature charm radiating effortlessly. There was no malice, no smugness, just an amused glint in his eyes as he turned slightly and gave Richard a small nod. "Safe travels, Richard," Brad said, his voice smooth and composed, as if the entire flight had been nothing more than a fleeting, insignificant moment. The words, though simple, carried a weight that crushed Richard further. The last thing he wanted was Brad Pitt himself acknowledging his embarrassment. His stomach twisted as he forced a stiff nod in return, unable to find words. As Brad disappeared through the jet bridge, Richard hesitated, glancing around. Several passengers were still watching, some grinning, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Defeated, Richard let out a shaky breath, gripping his briefcase tighter as he stepped forward. He had learned a harsh lesson, one he would never forget. As Richard stepped off the plane, the weight of his humiliation settled deep in his chest. The bustling terminal felt suffocating, every voice around him a reminder of his arrogance. He had spent his life believing that power came from speaking the loudest, from asserting dominance, from making others feel small. Yet, in a single moment, Brad Pitt had effortlessly dismantled that illusion without raising his voice, without breaking a sweat. Richard glanced at his reflection in a passing glass wall. His expensive suit, once a symbol of his success, now felt like a costume disguising his insecurity. He thought about how Brad had handled the situation, not with anger, not with confrontation, but with quiet confidence. As he walked toward baggage claim, he realized something. True power didn't come from making others feel inferior. It came from self-assurance, from knowing who you are without needing to prove it. "Safe travels, Richard," he said with a grin before disappearing into the bustling airport. Richard stood frozen in place, watching as Brad Pitt walked away, the realization fully sinking in. He had just insulted one of the most famous actors in the world, and the entire first-class cabin had witnessed it.